Anti-Semitic incidents apparently spiked after Bob Vylan's Glastonbury set. That's according to a Jewish security charity. Jewish communities are facing extreme levels of Jew hatred, the Community Security Trust said. The organisation, which monitors anti-Semitism in the UK, said a total of 1,521 anti-Semitic incidents were reported in the first half of 2025. It was the second highest number of its kind reported to CST, but down by a quarter from a record high in the first half of last year. An average of 8.4 incidents per day were reported in the first 6 months of the year. The highest daily total of 26 came on the 29th of June, the day after the performance by Bob Vylan at the Glastonbury Festival. So does this mean there was a spike of anti-Semitism after the set? I mean, we can't know for sure, but here's what we do know, is the Community Security Trust is seemingly a Zionist organisation. An article written in 2024 from the World Socialist website said, every year the Community Security Trust releases a report declaring the latest huge rise in anti-Semitism in Britain. Even the words Free Palestine, shouted on demonstrations for decades, are deemed anti-Semitic. Someone who shouts Free Palestine at people walking to a synagogue may be a staunch campaigner for Palestinian liberation, or perhaps they just consider it another weapon in their rhetorical arsenal to deploy against Jews. Now, okay, if someone were to deliberately provoke Jewish people under the guise of supporting Palestine, I can see how that's anti-Semitic. The problem we find is, are the CST making a distinction between genuine support for Palestine and anti-Semitic acts? This next paragraph may offer more insight. The CST stresses a total of 1,299 anti-Semitic incidents exhibited anti-Zionist motivation compared to 149 in 2022. Alongside anti-Semitic language or targeting, while the terms Zionism or Zionist were used on 260 occasions, often as euphemism for Judaism and Jew, or alongside other anti-Semitic language. In at least 427 instances, the phrase Free Palestine was employed in speech or writing in an anti-Semitic way. Now, to me, that is a conflation. Anti-Zionist motivation is not anti-Semitic. Just claiming that Zionist is a euphemism for Judaism and Jew is another conflation. Now, this isn't the first organisation to blur the lines between anti-Zionist sentiment and anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League have recorded an increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the US, yet they've also included anti-Zionism in their definitions. Stephen, we can acknowledge that anti-Semitism may have increased from the 7th of October, but we are still seeing a massive push from organisations and the media weaponising this form of hatred to stifle criticisms of Israel. Do you think this weaponization harms the Jewish community?
I mean, it certainly does harm the Jewish community. I mean, I guess what I would like to say is that, I actually do believe that anti-Semitism has increased. And the reason that I believe that is because that is what non-Zionist Jews have been telling us would happen for the last 20 months. They've been telling us for months that the biggest threat to Jews in the world is Benjamin Netanyahu and his activities, his assault, his genocide in Gaza. And that as a result of that, anti-Semitic speech, anti-Semitic attacks will increase. Now, that is not a justification. That is not to say that it's okay for that to have happened. I'm sure that those anti-Zionist Jews who made that prediction weren't saying that was okay, but they're giving a very clear causal explanation for why the activities of Israel in Gaza, the genocide, has increased anti-Semitism for Jews all around the world. And I mean, I don't know if you saw recently Mandy Patinkin interviewed by the New York Times, who is not an anti-Zionist Jew, who is a Zionist Jew, who made a similar sort of argument where he was like, actually, Netanyahu is endangering all of us through his activities. So, but before getting into the question of the weaponization of anti-Semitism, I mean, I just would be happy to acknowledge that like anti-Semitism probably has increased because people do associate, and and I think they shouldn't associate all Jews with Israel. Although, of course, there is like an intimate connection between the two in many cases. And I think like another source of an increase in anti-Semitism is a kind of mystery around the behavior of our public institutions and our governments in the West. So if you take the Bob Vylan set in Glastonbury, what was the chant? It was death, death to the IDF. So a particular chant about an army in another country doing a genocide. But what were the headlines? The headlines were all about anti-Semitism and the feelings of Jewish Britons, not all of them, but some, that these were anti-Semitic comments, and of course then statements by our government, our ministers, Lisa Nandy, that this was anti-Semitic. And people look at that and they say, okay, this person made a statement about a genocidal army in Israel. The content of that statement is not the news. The content of that statement, that the IDF should not exist because of what they're doing, actually quite a reasonable thing to say. The content of that statement gets completely erased and it gets replaced instead with talk of anti-Semitism. And there is an anti-Semitic trope, which is that Jews control the world. That is an anti-Semitic trope. It's an ancient it's a trope. So that leads people to think that that's true. The same when we look at our governments, we look at how supine this government is, our government in Britain is in relation to Israel. We look at how the US rolls over or supports Israel in every single moment. That mystery of why the governments in the West think so highly of Israel, this tiny little country in the Middle East. The mystery of that tends to lend credence to the idea that there is some kind of Jewish conspiracy, which is an anti-Semitic trope. Because the fact is that it's not that control over the West comes from Israel. It's rather that the West is deeply geopolitically interested in the existence of Israel, not as a kind of home for Jewish people, not as a state for Jewish people, but rather as an entity which continues to disrupt that region, whose existence will continue to divide, disrupt a very asset-wealthy region, a region which, were there more Arab unity, would create a much larger bloc and a threat to Western hegemony. So it's geopolitical relations that do this, but it can look to people like the conspiracy theory, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which is the mistake. But it does tell us something about when the end of Zionism will come. The end of Zionism will come when the geopolitics changes. Once Israel is no longer of interest or of use to the West, it will be just like South Africa was. Apartheid South Africa was of use to the West because it was a bulwark against Pan-Africanism in the continent and the USSR, interest in communism, USSR support for Pan-Africanism, and South Africa was a kind of bulwark against it. When the geopolitics changed, when the USSR came to an end, nobody cared about South Africa anymore. It will be the same with Israel. When the geopolitics change, the West will no longer be interested in Israel. But in the meantime, Netanyahu's activities, his genocide, his endless assault on Gaza will continue to create anti-Semitism for Jews around the world. That is not a justification for it. It isn't. I despise it. I despise anti-Semitism, all kinds of racial hatred I despise, but it will continue to do it as there will be a causal mechanism that will make that the case. And as I say, anti-Zionist Jews have been telling us that since the beginning of this genocide.
Yeah, you're quite right. There's a lot of strands to this. I think one, because conflating Jewish people with Israel is in of itself anti-Semitic. Yet we see a lot of people who claim other people are anti-Semitic do that exact thing. And you're right, that can then lead people to believe in this kind of conspiracy, almost confirming it for them. In terms of Israel being a settler colony, it is absolutely at the behest of the West, right? It's the other way around. It's not Israel controlling us. I mean, Israel obviously has massive influence. We have an Israeli lobby, but it's not like the West aren't interested and we're doing their bidding. It's a mutual thing. I mean, think back to the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the Israeli state. That was Britain wanted that as well. So it's a multifaceted thing, and I think there's probably some people who are getting confused about the conflation, because I know there is an absolute sort of push for those who genuinely think you're not anti-Semitic to smear you as that, and I think that happens a lot. But I also think, and I don't know if it's a bigger or smaller part of it, but there's certainly people who probably aren't doing it on purpose, but have fallen into the trap that, well, actually, I think that was anti Semitic. But rather, they're listening to a lot of our media and our politicians who, when you bring up Bob Vylan, for example, immediately assuming anti Semitism when he's talking about the IDF. He's talking about a state army. A state is not a protected characteristic. When you have essentially the entire media ensemble claiming that's anti Semitic, a lot of people might get confused by that as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, maybe, although we have seen it before. I mean, you just have to look at like Zohran Mamdani in New York, which, they came at him from every angle with anti-Semitism, and like 1/5 of Democrats, I think, well, maybe it was even higher, but a very large number of Democrat-registered Jewish New Yorkers voted for Mamdani. He has a lot of support amongst Jewish New Yorkers, and yeah, the anti-Semitism stuff didn't stick, and it's not going to stick when it comes to things like the New Left Party either, because we've seen it before and we've seen what it can do, and yeah, it won't. They'll try it, but it won't work again. I think we're much more equipped with a kind of conceptual framework and vocabulary to be able to counter it than maybe we were, 6 or 7 years ago.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.